World leaders are arriving in Hangzhou, China, for the 2016 G20 summit. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. For the first time, China is hosting the annual G20 summit in Hangzhou. Chinese President Xi Jinping and other world leaders will discuss new partnerships and propose solutions to some of the world's most pressing economic issues. As the world's largest developing country and second largest economy, China is giving a greater focus to developing countries, including many of those from Africa. We begin with our coverage from this report from CCTV's Guo Show in Hangzhou.
Hello, Nathan. China, as the host this year, seeks to create new sources of growth for the global economy. That will come up with a blueprint that focuses on innovation. It's also the concept that China is upholding domestically. There will be much consideration on supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, and China's e-commerce giant Jack Ma will also propose to build an electronic world trade platform. China has introduced the issue of green financing to G20 and emphasizes on structural reform to rebalance physical and monetary issues. China also wants to ward off growing protectionism in key economies and upgrade the G20 itself as a platform for global governance. So there will be action plan of development. There will also be an accountability paper to follow up policies carried out. China has invited 6 developing countries to the summit: Chad, chair of the African Union; Laos, chair of the ASEAN; Senegal, chair of the New Partnership for Africa's Development; and Thailand as chair of the Group 77 this year. China also invited Egypt and Kazakhstan as typical developing countries. Since G20 was founded in 1999, it has been centered on economic crisis management, with development economies to the fore. But while the G20 member economies contribute to over 80% of global GDP, the developing countries have over 85% of global population. Most are not in the G20. While the theme of this year's G20 is interconnected and inclusive, China believes this reflects the appeal of developing countries. The G20 topic of infrastructure, food safety, and climate change are major concerns of developing countries and are aligned with the UN 2030 development agenda. So China, as the world's largest developing country, won the summit to better represent developing countries.
Joining us now from Beijing is Jin-Ke Yu. She's a professor of economics at the London School of Economics. Also with us from Shanghai is Hung Tran. He's the executive managing director of the Institute of International Finance. And from Johannesburg, we are joined by Cobus van Studden. He is a lecturer in media studies at the University of Witwatersrand and the co-founder of the online publication, the China-Africa Project. Welcome to you all. Thank you. Jin-Ke Yu, let's start with you in Beijing. This year's G20 summit has what's been called the 4 I's: innovative, invigorated, interconnected and inclusive. What does that mean, and what's China's main goal of this year's summit in Hangzhou?
Well, I think they really set out a quite comprehensive plan to tackle things like global inequality and innovation. And I think that, you know, one of the the foremost problems we're facing today is really slow world growth, not only in this country but everywhere around. And so I think that the emphasis on innovation, structural reforms driven growth, is very different from the kind of growth that we would rely on credit-fueled and debt-fueled. So this is one of the key points. But I think that global coordination, global governance is also another major important critical aspect, because the world is really facing tough protectionism. We tend to see more protectionist tendencies when the world economy is not doing well, which is the case right now. So I think that is one of the major issues they need to tackle.
Hung Tran, in Shanghai, what about that idea that global growth is not great against the backdrop of this G20 summit, and also there is changes in the way the global economic system will be governed in the future? How is that going to be achieved, do you think, through this G20 platform?
I think it is very important that by implement the set of ideas that have been floated and discussed at the G20 summit, China can help move the world economy to a more sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. Basically, the key idea is to make full use of the whole set of toolkits of macroeconomic policies, including fiscal policy and reform policies, to help the economy recover. But more importantly, and I concur with the previous speaker, in the atmosphere where growth is slow, world trade stagnant, and in many countries anti-trade and anti-globalization sentiment is on the rise, it is important for the leaders to really push back against protectionism and to reaffirm an open trade and investment environment which has served the world economy very well in the past half century.
Cobus, in Johannesburg, the last of those four I's I mentioned was inclusive. And as well as South Africa obviously being a member of the G20, more and more African nations and developing nations invited to attend through the new economic partnership for African development, the AU and such. What's the importance of increasing participation in the G20?
I think it's very important. In the first place, some of the biggest, fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. So increasingly, if one is talking about expanding trade and liberalizing trade, one has to move beyond the traditional G20 members and include more of the developing world, especially more from Africa.
And in terms of what, obviously, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is also going to be pushing the Sustainable Development Goals, which replace the Millennial Development Goals, poverty reduction targets. How does that play in with Africa?
I think it's incredibly important. Africa is because Africa is in this weird position of opportunity where it can leapfrog into more sustainable development. And China has actually been quite an interesting kind of leader in that sense. China has been instrumental in putting in a lot of green technology, for example, and also in China itself, and also instrumental in pushing that in Africa. So Africa is in this interesting position where it can actually move towards more innovative, sustainable development models if it gets the right support.
Jinko, I'd like to pick up on what Cobus just said in terms of China's economic experience and what it's going to share over the next few days. We've seen the One Belt, One Road initiative, of course, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, lots of new sort of ways of dealing with investment, infrastructure, despite the fact that China's economy is also slowing down, although still growing very rapidly when you compare it to more developed countries. So what's the message here from China about what they've learned and what could be taken on?
Well, I think that you mentioned a crucial factor for China's rapid growth and development, which is infrastructure. Now, China has the advantage of being a big government, having a big government, and being able to pool a large amount of saving to invest in and coordinate in the construction of infrastructure, which of course promotes trade and substantially reduces the cost of capital and cost of investment. Now, this is not a privilege that many other countries are able to enjoy, especially the smaller developing economies, and this is something that China, along with other countries, are trying to put an effort in manifested by this the new institutional framework to invest in infrastructure. So that is definitely a key point. But I think that China, by stressing innovation, it's really coming from the bottom of China's heart, understanding that this kind of overinvestment, supply side kind of growth is not sustainable, and that ultimately the source of long-term growth has to be from productivity, and that is inseparable, inextricable from innovation and R&D investment.
I'm glad you mentioned it, because I want to go to Hangzhou about not the G20, but the B20, which is a sort of side grouping of business leaders that are going to be meeting in Hangzhou as well. What does the business community see coming out of this in terms of where the global economy goes and also global governance?
I think that the B20 summit, also meeting in Hangzhou next few days, completely support the G20 leadership agenda to promote growth. So we propose some practical and concrete ideas. One, in terms of infrastructure, governments need also to address the series of impediments to private sector investment in long-term infrastructure projects. Those impediments have been identified and presented to the G20 leadership several times, and I think that it is important to deal with them and create the markets and the capital markets instrument to mobilize private sector investment. In terms of trade, we want to be also very concrete and practical. So one of the key recommendations is for the countries to complete the ratification of the trade facilitation agreement reached in Bali a few years ago. Even though small in the bigger scheme of things, such final ratification can help to restart and promote world trade, which is, as I said before, quite stagnant. And last but not least, to create the legal and regulatory environment which foster and nurture and promote innovation, particularly financial technology, which can be harnessed to increase financial inclusion.
Cobus, at these gatherings, world leaders and business leaders always like to swap best practices, examples of things that are going right. When it comes to sort of China-Africa investment and infrastructure, what particular projects in your mind stick out that could show the way in Hangzhou?
One of the interesting projects is an integrated rail development that's taking place with Chinese finance and Chinese construction across the whole of East Africa. So it stretches essentially, it integrates Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, so several of those areas, and then it also links to the wider One Belt, One Road connection, you know, kind of through to Europe and back to Beijing. So, you know, this is an interesting development in the sense that it is infrastructure based, but it's also regional, and I think it points the road ahead to how developing economies can be integrated and change from individual states into regional growth networks.
Jin-Ke, I want to come back to this idea of innovation that you mentioned in your last answer, because it's top of the agenda of the G20. It's also in Chinese government plans. It's one of the first words seen. How is that going in China? There have been some critics in the West that say China is not necessarily as innovative as the United States, for example.
No, I think that's also a misrepresentation of what's going on in China. First of all, R&D growth as a share of GDP is one of the fastest in the world in China. So that's something to recognize. And also, it is very much aligned with policy direction. You see all kinds of government effort to promote innovation and to subsidize incentives for firms to invest in innovation and technology. And we have many experiences, or we have many examples in our daily lives that showcase that China's innovative capacity. So I think, but I think nevertheless, one of the problems is still going back to intellectual property rights. That is still very much a problem, especially for foreigners. There are a lot of technology that China wants to import in order to enhance its technological innovation efforts, but is unable to do so because of this critical problem of intellectual property rights. So they need to tackle this issue on both fronts. But I think that in terms of productivity growth, if we really look at the macroeconomic data, productivity growth in China is actually very rapid. So I don't think it's completely correct to say that there is no innovation effort. By just looking at the data, the investment in R&D is already quite impressive.
Hang Chuan, is that a model for Asia to innovate its way into, to keep growth going?
I think it is a very important element now is to undertake structural reform to allow the economy to be able to derive growth impetus from a variety of sources and not just reliant on manufacture exports like the case in the past few decades. And in this endeavor, innovation, technology improvement, which enhance the competitiveness and the range of new ideas and products and services will be key for countries to regain growth.
And Cobus, for Africa, I presume this is as important, having more of more ownership of the value chain, if you like. In previous decades, Africa has been a resource-based economy, but being innovative would also create different models of growth, correct?
Yes. Africa is currently trying to work out a new model of growth for itself. As you said, the resource-based economies that have pushed some African growth over the last 2 decades is also to a certain extent seen as hollow, in the sense that this form of growth doesn't really create jobs. So what's happening now is there's a strong push to try and beneficiate African resources, and at the same time to grow Africa as a consumer base. And I think both of those are happening to a certain extent on the back of the laying of these kind of networks, most notably rail networks, but also very fundamentally internet and communication networks. And so, kind of as those networks are starting to be laid, you see African innovators starting to develop products for African markets particularly, and African markets are being unified to a large extent.
Fascinating discussion. We'll talk more about the 4 Eyes when we come back. We do need to take a break. More of our discussion on China's role at the G20 summit right after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the G20 summit and China's role in promoting global economic growth. Let's get back to our panel. Jinke Yu in Beijing. Interconnected is also one of the big themes of the G20, and this seems to fit very squarely with the Chinese policy of One Belt, One Road, the new maritime Silk Road, opening up ASEAN members, the RCEP trade platform. This is kind of one of the key things that China wants to push forward, correct?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think the backdrop is we need to understand that there's 2 kinds of integration. One is trade integration and one is financial integration. So let's not forget, while there have been a lot of efforts put into trade integration, financial integration is changing the world on a daily basis. So in that sense, we have to understand that the macroeconomic condition in the world is quite particular. In the last few years, ever since the crisis, growth has still been anemic, and interest rate have hit the lower zero bound. So, and then with the spread of global banks, the kind of global capital and global credit can cause credit booms and retrenchments easily. These are things to take heed, and requires a certain amount of policy and government coordination. And in terms of geographical interconnectedness, of course, as we mentioned earlier on, building infrastructure is very important for development of these developing countries. But also, interestingly enough, in this low interest rate environment, monetary policy being slightly ineffective, to say the least, here is where fiscal policy can potentially play a major role. And hence, this is also why infrastructure investment is not only important for the subjects of these infrastructure plans, but also for the investor countries as well.
You make a good point about the difference between financial and geographical interconnectedness. Hangzhou in Shanghai, let's talk about the financial and the trade deals, because so much effort has been put into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it seems to be dying here in Washington. Both presidential candidates up for election in November are basically rejecting it. It doesn't look like it's going to get through Congress. Not many other countries are doing it. The European example too seems to be slipping, and there's this sort of feeling of protectionism in the air. How does the G20 address that, considering their agenda is almost completely opposite?
Well, the G20 leadership can address it head-on by highlighting the benefits that open trade and globalization has brought to the world economy, particularly in terms of alleviating poverty in many developing countries in the past 30 years, 40 years. Secondly, by including and emphasizing measures to promote inclusive growth so that everyone can participate and share in the fruits of open trade and globalization, which has been the key weakness that has been criticized and have led to discontent and the fueling of anti-trade and anti-globalization sentiment in many countries. Last but not least, countries, when they enter into agreement, need to also seriously implement all the commitments that they have made to to demonstrate that the trade system we have is not only open but fair, and everyone perceives that the benefits that they can get from the deal is equally shared.
Indeed, point well taken. Cobus, what's going to be African nations' view on trade and open trade? Not always a big benefiter in the past.
Well, African nations are in the first place are moving towards breaking down trade barriers between themselves. So that is a kind of a large move within Africa to try and kind of break down tariff barriers and so on, and kind of linking that with making it easier to move stuff around on the continent and to sell stuff in other countries on the continent. In relation to the rest of the world, I think it's Africa is at such a disadvantage frequently to other in relation to other economies, and you see this playing out a lot in the popular perception of China, where there's just frequently a kind of a popular fear in Africa in relation to how much Chinese stuff is being imported. So I think selling kind of free trade internationally to Africans can sometimes be hard, but I think it's also increasingly there's a strong feeling that Africans want to be part of the global economy, and so I think in being integrated into the global economy is increasingly becoming very, very important in Africa.
We talked about interconnectedness. I'd like to pick up on the word invigorated, a great word, but what does it actually mean, Jinko Yu, for the G20? I presume we've had this period now where you've had quantitative easing, you've had some countries take austerity, none seems to be one model fits all. So how does the invigoration happen in Hangzhou over the next few days?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm wondering whether they want to find another IN word to fit, the
We've
pack.
got four.
But,
we've got four. We can go for five.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. But I think growth is a little bit lackluster these days, and with ineffectiveness of monetary policy, I think invigoration means really focusing on growth that is not necessarily stimulated by more credit and credit expansion and more borrowing, but really coming back to the fundamentals, which is either increases in factors or productivity, as we have mentioned, and to really rely on reforms, supply-side reforms, both not only in China but elsewhere in Europe as well, to really bring back the energy, the dynamism of an economy. So I think it's really important to distinguish different types of growth. There is growth that is obtained by more credit expansion, the kind of growth that we experienced in the western part of the world between 2003, right up to leading up to the Great Crisis, and growth based on fundamentals, right? So I think invigoration captures the idea that we need to rely on reforms and innovation, coming back to our previous topic.
Talking about innovation and also reforms, Hung Tran, we are going through obviously a period of climate change. The United States and China coming together, surprising the world ahead of the Paris Accord, and real engine for that. Also, there's sort of this technological revolution when it comes to the green technologies of the future. How much is that part of the G20 agenda, and is it getting enough attention outside of perhaps the US and China who are competing, Hung Tran?
I think it is squarely in the agenda of the G20 for several years. So two key points I want to highlight. One is it is very important to embed and to marry the infrastructure idea with green finance, because at this stage any future infrastructure project should be done with a view to sustainable and environmental sustainability. That means green finance will have to feature prominently in infrastructure financing in the future. And secondly, countries and leaders can do a lot to encourage and promote the growth of markets solution to combat climate change. Things like a market for green bonds, which is starting to develop. Things like the market for carbon cap and trades, and things like a green investment philosophy on the part of institutional investors. All of those should be promoted.
Cobus, for you in Johannesburg, African countries pushing forward the climate change and green economy change, obviously very important because a lot of African countries big victims of climate change.
Yes, this is the great fear in Africa that as climate change worsens, rich nations will find ways to lift their own domestic situations, to safeguard their own domestic situations, and Africa will be essentially left out, burning in the sun. So I think Africa has been quite aggressive in trying to find, sustainable ways of gaining more energy, and of course Africa needs more energy. Africa needs more electricity and needs more sustainable electricity. So trying to push forward to gain both at the same time, to not be blanketed by pollution, but at the same time to have a sustainable, trustworthy kind of source of electricity. That is Africa's big challenge, and to a certain extent China has helped with that, but there needs to be a lot more done.
Let's move on. Jinko Yu, not just a G20 summit talking about economic agenda, of course, this is where world leaders meet. President Xi Jinping expected to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin, also US President Barack Obama, who's on his last trip to Asia as he leaves office. Can we expect them to come out of these meetings?
I think it's a meeting where there has to be a practical accommodation of reality, and the reality is quite clear. Russia needs China's markets and capital with its Western sanctions, and China needs Russia's diplomatic support and energy. And it doesn't help that the U.S. is quite active, let's say, or aggressive in some of the geopolitics involved that China is involved. So I think there's an axis of shift that might, slightly work towards a closer Sino-Russia alliance, or at least the relationships.
Okay, final minute or so. Hang Chuan, just quickly, what do you think will mean success for the G20?
I think two things. One is to make sure that every country should make use of all the policy tools at their disposal to encourage growth, because a long period of slow growth is the greatest menace to the world economy. And secondly, to take a concrete measure to preserve and promote the open trade and investment system that we have enjoyed very much in the past.
And Cobus, what would be your best takeaway from the G20?
I would love to have more African voices heard. I feel the G20 needs to be more inclusive, and growing African economies need to be included. Nigeria and Kenya probably the most notably. South Africa is a member, but we need more African members.
Jinko Yu, what would spell success in Hangzhou?
I think what is practical and feasible for this kind of congregation is to work together to fight against global protectionism.
Thank you so much from Beijing, from Shanghai, from Joburg. That's all we have time for this edition of The Heat. Stay with CCTV America online and on the air for continuous coverage of the G20 summit in Hangzhou. Our website is cctv-america.com/G20. I'm Nick Kim, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.